In 2011, after the Great East Japan earthquake, Natsu Hyuga started writing a story. Now, at the time, fantasy reincarnations, also known as isekais, were really popular, but Hyuga wanted to write something different. And in that pursuit, she came up with the Apothecary Diaries, a story set in a fictionalized version of Imperial China that centers around Maomao, a young apothecary working and living in the pleasure districts of the capital city of the country of Li, who unexpectedly gets kidnapped one day and sold into the Rear Palace to work as a servant for 2 years. Now, the Rear Palace, also known as the Emperor's Garden, also known as the home of all of his concubines and where all of his heirs are made, is a place teeming with intrigue, deception, and mysteries around every corner. And while Maomao's initial plan is to not get involved in anything, to mind her business, to get through her 2 years and go back home, she cannot help but get wrapped up in that intrigue, in that deception, and in those mysteries. With her intelligence, perception, insatiable curiosity when it comes to medicines and poison, and generally just wonderful problem-solving skills, Maomao cannot help but get wrapped up in everything happening in the Rear Palace, because along with all of that stuff, she also has this desire, this insatiable urge to right the wrongs happening around her. And so the Apothecary Diaries, especially in the first season, focuses on Maomao solving all of these different mysteries and just getting involved with all of these different people that she ideally wanted to stay away from. Now, did Natsu Hyuga know at the time when she was writing the story that she was crafting my next hyperfixation? Absolutely not, but here we are. And after talking about the Apothecary Diaries for a couple of months on my TikTok, I decided that this really called for a long form format. So here we are. Can we talk about the Apothecary Diaries in excruciating detail, with this video focusing on the first 3 episodes of season 1. So without further ado, let's talk about season 1, episode 1 of the Apothecary Diaries, titled Maomao. Now, I want to say right off the bat, after watching these 3 episodes again after a significant amount of time, I did not realize how dense they are and how much is just jam-packed into them as far as information about Maomao, the Rear Palace, and just the world of the Apothecary Diaries in general. Like, the first 2 minutes of episode 1 do a very good job at establishing a lot of different things about Maomao and how she grew up. Starting off with the obvious one, she is poor, something that's made very clear to us when you see the home that she lives in. We also get the sense that she has a really warm and loving relationship with her father, and as they're chatting in the morning before Maomao leaves to go do work, her father notes that she needs to be careful because kidnappings have been going up in the area. Gee, I wonder what could go wrong. Now, as Maomao is leaving home to go into the pleasure district to work, you get a real sense as a viewer that there is this self-assuredness and industriousness to her as a character, from the way that she is walking with this sense of purpose and confidence, and also with the way that she essentially just kind of shrugs off her father saying, you know, kidnappings are on the rise. You get this sense that Maomao can handle herself. And as we see the pleasure district for the first time, it makes sense that she is someone who can handle herself, because this is a place that's bustling, that's full of people, that's full of all different types of people, including a group of men that are eyeing her a little bit as she's making her way over to Verdegree's house. And this setting suggests that you do need to be street smart and confident in order to survive. And obviously, because she is on her way to deliver medicine, we learn that she is somebody who works in medicine. But beyond working as an apothecary, you get an immediate sense that Maomao is curious, passionate, and really, really dedicated to her craft, as she is literally actively harming herself and doing experiments on her own body. Something that she is not particularly concerned about, but other people are. Case in point, Pyrene walking in and saying, "Are you doing experiments on yourself again?" And Maomao generally responding with this air of nonchalance, where she doesn't really have a ton of regard for her own health and safety. While it's clear that it would make sense that most of Maomao's clientele would be courtesans working in brothels, it's clear that she has a particularly special relationship with Verdegree's house, which, with the piles of silver, the line out the door, the beautiful decor, the fact that there are 3 infamous princesses at this establishment, suggests that the Verdegree's house is a higher class institution with a lot more exclusivity. And we see that Maomao is quite close and familiar with the women who work here, particularly the famed 3 princesses. I think what is so interesting about this interaction between Pyrene and Maomao at Verdegree's house, where Maomao is doing her experiments and Pyrene comes up to hug her from behind, is the relationship relationship that's established between the way that your body looks and your social class or just access in general to resources. Because when Pyrene is hugging her, she asks her if she's been eating, and Maomao responds by saying that it seems like you've been eating enough for the both of us, referring to Pyrene's boobs that are very much on Maomao's back and she can feel them. Now, when I made TikToks about this, discussing the relationship between, physical appearance and access to food and other resources, some people on TikTok did not like this relationship being drawn because they were like, well, women can also just be naturally skinny and scrawny like Maomao is. And that to say that Maomao's physical appearance is correlated to her literally not eating enough because she's poor takes away from the fact that there are bodies that are naturally like this. And what I will say to these people is that I understand where you are coming from, but I think it is also important for you to remember that you are not an Apothecary Diaries character, and that beauty standards in many places around the world historically, including Imperial China, have been tied to your access to food and resources. Because if you are a, more filled out person, a paler person, somebody who is not scrawny, that tends to suggest that you have access to an abundance of food and that you also have the means by which to not work a laborious job where you are burning that food off. It's a signifier of wealth, and I think that it is particularly important in the context of this story. Now, in this scene, we also meet Granny and get an interaction between Maomao and the old granny, and I think that this is where we start to see some of the nuances in this kind of close, very familial-like relationship between Maomao and the women at Verdegree's house, where you get a bit of a funny moment where Granny's like, hey, Maomao, the damage that you did with that experiment, you got to pay for it. I'm adding it to your debt. And Mama's like, yeah, of course, Granny. And it's like this very fun, quirky moment. And then Granny's like, or you could become a courtesan. And that sends Maomao running, where in her internal dialogue, she talks about how this is not the first time that Granny has brought up the possibility of bringing Maomao into that type of work, a prospect that Maomao clearly finds to be very displeasing. So while this interaction suggests that there is this fondness and familiarity, there is also this clear nuance in this relationship where Granny is at first a businesswoman. On her way home, we see that Maomao stops off at an herb field and is just so enthusiastic and excited and filled with joy at the prospect of harvesting all of these medicinal herbs, again, further cementing this real love and dedication for her craft in the field of medicine. It's also the last thing Maomao is doing before she gets kidnapped. Now, the kidnapping scene itself is very, very brief. It's very quick and to the point. You don't learn anything interpersonal about Maomao's kidnappers. There's no struggle shown to us. But what I think makes this scene very interesting is Maomao's reaction to getting kidnapped as she is sitting in a carriage on the way to the rear palace. She's not crying. There is no indication of any kind of distress. She just kind of resignedly sighs and is like, oh, my dad is going to be so worried about me when I don't come home. There's a real nonchalance to it, which lets us as viewers know that this protagonist is a little unconventional and operates a little bit differently than most people would under similar circumstances. Then we cut to a scene of one of the emperor's concubines, Lady Lihua, giving birth to her son, and we also see another concubine, Lady Gyokyo, holding her own young newborn daughter. And we also see Lady Gyokyo reacting with relief to the fact that Lady Lihua's birth went well. Then we flash forward to 3 months later, where Maomao is working as a servant in the rear palace, very much missing the food that she can get in the pleasure district. And while in Maomao's internal dialogue, she talks about being worried about her father, particularly whether he's eating or not, there is still this very kind of nonchalant, blasé tone to the way that she is talking about this, where it's clear that she is somebody who does care and have concern for the people in her life, but she is also clearly not a very overly sentimental person. Along with this, Maomao's internal dialogue in this scene also draws a comparison between the brothels in the pleasure district and the lives of the concubines in the rear palace, and this internal dialogue is cut over a scene of some concubines just conversing with each other, and this suggests that there are a lot more parallels happening between the lives of these women, despite the fact that they are occupying very different roles in very different places in society. But Maomao also makes it clear that if she was going to pick one, she would pick the brothels. We also continue to see Maomao really refusing to fall into any kind of trappings of nostalgia here, where she's just kind of like, hey, we're here. My life has been flipped upside down, but there really is no point in dwelling on it. Maomao then proceeds to give us a basic rundown of the function of the rear palace and the various social hierarchies in it. As mentioned before, the rear palace is the epicenter for creating heirs. It is the garden through which the emperor's seed is sown. There are no men allowed aside from the emperor and his kin, as well as eunuchs, who are missing a very important part of their bodies, which would potentially, jeopardize the assuredness that the kids coming out of this place daughters were in fact the emperor's kids. There's about 2,000 concubines in the rear palace, with 1,000 eunuchs charged with protecting them. And in terms of hierarchy, you have the high-ranking concubines, then you have the mid-ranking concubines, then you have the low-ranking concubines, and then you have the servant girls, who are very much expendable and can be very harshly punished for even the tiniest of infractions because nobody cares about them. They are at the bottom of the barrel. However, in this generally quite restrictive hierarchy, Maomao also talks about how there is the potential for upward social mobility if you are a servant girl that happens to catch the emperor's eye. Because if you catch the emperor's eye, you can be promoted to being a low-ranking concubine. However, Maomao notes that standing out in a place like the rear palace, catching the emperor's attention can be dangerous, which we learn more about as the episodes progress. And then finally, we get Maomao telling us, the viewer, what her goal is while she is here, which is essentially to mind her own business, get through her 2-year contract, and then go home. With Maomao's goal to lay low in mind, we then cut to the main problem facing the rear palace at the moment, which is that the emperor's 2 newborn babies, as well as concubine Li Hua, are all sick and no one can figure out why. We also learned that this is not the first time that the emperor's children have gotten sick, with his 3 previous heirs also dying of a mysterious illness. Then we cut to Maomao and her friend Xiaolan talking, and we get a sense of what Xiaolan's role is in this dynamic with Maomao, which is essentially keeping her updated on what's happening in the rear palace, because Maomao is not somebody that is particularly chatty and also doesn't really keep up with gossip, even when it could potentially be useful for her. And in return, Maomao helps her read. We also get some insight into the politics of the rear palace, as well as how the imperial harem system works in the world of the Apothecary Diaries, with Maomao and Xiaolan pointing out the fact that because there hasn't been an established empress consort, Lady Li Hua by default right now is currently the empress consort because she has given birth to a son. However, rumors suggest that Lady Gyokyo is actually the emperor's favorite. And then in this next scene, we learn that even when Maomao wants to mind her own business, her curiosity oftentimes wins out. We cut to a confrontation between Li Hua and Gyokyo, and it's actually the only time where we see them having like a full-on face-to-face conversation, and unfortunately in this situation it is not positive because Li Hua slaps Gyokyo in the face, much to the horror of all of the onlookers in the rear palace. We also get some insight into gender dynamics in the imperial harem because Lady Li Hua, in her exhaustion, in her sickness, accuses Gyokyo of orchestrating all of this because she was not able to give birth to a son herself and could only give the emperor a daughter, suggesting that Gyokyo was upset about the fact that Li Hua gave birth to an heir proper before Gyokyo could. And Gyokyo's response to this accusation and to physical violence against her showcases a lot about her character and how measured and reasonable she can be even in these really heightened emotional moments. Because even after being slapped in front of an audience, mind you, Gyokyo maintains a level head and simply says, that doesn't make any sense because my daughter is also suffering from the same affliction. You are more than welcome to examine her, but it would be absolutely absurd for me to make my own daughter sick in order to sabotage you and your son. And then we see the doctor of the rear palace trying to manage this conflict between the two of them, and we very much quickly get the sense that he is kind of a bumbling fool, and Maomao also vocalizes this, suggesting that he is one bill short of being a quack. And this also gives us insight into the quality of medical services in the rear palace, which are clearly not great. And Maomao, upon seeing Lady Li Hua's condition and the various symptoms that she is presenting, realizes what the issue is here and is really shocked that the quack doctor has not picked up on it yet. She's like, it's so obvious. It's right there. And despite the fact that she is determined to lay low, now that Maomao knows what the cause of the affliction is, she decides that she needs to find a way to write and get this message to the concubines. And while she is talking to herself as she's walking away from this scene, trying to figure out how she is going to deliver this message to Lady Li Hua and Lady Gyokyo, Maomao walks past Jinshi and he hears her say this, which suggests to us as viewers that Jinshi is somebody who is really observant of the things happening around him when he catches this kind of offbeat remark being made by a servant girl that happens to be walking past him as he is going to go and diffuse the situation between these two concubines. And then we cut to a scene that starts to hint at some problems at Lady Li Hua's pavilion, the Crystal Pavilion, where when one of her ladies in waiting is walking past the windowsill and sees a note that has been tied to a flower that symbolizes warning, the lady in waiting simply takes it without even reading the note and tosses it off the side of the window so that nobody finds it. And then we unfortunately cut to Lady Li Hua mourning the death of her son. However, in contrast to Lady Li Hua's lady-in-waiting, we see that Gyokyo did heed the advice that was given on this warning and calls Jinshi in to try to investigate what's happened here. Now, in this exchange between Jinshi and Gyokyo, we get even more insight into the type of person that Gyokyo is, where she states very just pointedly that ignorance is truly a sin. And she recognizes that this was invaluable information for her to get because it literally saved her daughter's life, and she wants Jinshi to find out who wrote the note. Now, the scene of Jinshi singling Maomao out is one of my favorites from season 1. I think this scene gives you a really great sneak peek into the dynamic between these two characters in the season moving forward, with Jinshi just being very charming and Maomao being kind of very much off-put by this performance and this charm, whilst also simultaneously continuously talking about how beautiful Jinshi is in her internal dialogue, and how his looks are such a waste given that he's a eunuch. And as Jinshi holds up a sign to a sea of illiterate servants, sans Maomao, saying, "Hey, you with the freckles, stay here," Maomao is perplexed at the fact that she has been caught because she thought through this plan really carefully. Maomao is intelligent, Maomao is perceptive, Maomao is also a very crafty individual, and she made sure that nobody saw her when she did this. And while some of it could be argued as being luck, because, you know, Jinshi was coincidentally walking past Maomao as she was starting to concoct this plan out loud, I think it also showcases that Jinshi can be just as intelligent and perceptive as her, and that they are very much a good match as far as wits go. I also think it's just deeply funny that Maomao constantly talks about how much she wants things to be uncomplicated as she deals with the consequences of her actions that are very contrary to this sentiment. While Maomao is incredibly intelligent, perceptive, and very, very conscious of the social hierarchies in which she exists, she can also hilariously lack self-awareness. And now that she's been discovered, she goes into this meeting with Gyokyo and Jinshi, where she is very much like apprehensive, has her guard up, and is not sure whether she's going to be rewarded or punished for what she did, but it seems like Maomao is very much leaning towards she's going to be punished. Now, as Maomao is explaining to Jinshi and Gyokyo what happened here, how she went about figuring this out, I think it's important to note that this first mystery that Maomao solves in the Rear Palace does not necessarily primarily highlight her technical knowledge as an apothecary so much as it showcases the knowledge that she has from her lived experience in the Pleasure District and the experiences of the courtesans that she was seeing around her using this white face powder. I think this does a really good job at tying in that earlier sentiment that Maomao makes, where she draws a comparison between life in the Pleasure District and life in the Rear Palace, and that they aren't all that different. Case in point, the fact that both groups are dealing with the same affliction due to the same high-end face powder, due to the same lack of knowledge about the deathly effects that it can have on you. And while Maomao's technical knowledge as an apothecary is obviously a massive asset to her, specifically her knowledge and curiosity around poisons, her lived experience as somebody who grew up in this very specific setting cannot be divorced from who she is and the way that she sees the world. And that is part of what makes Maomao so intriguing. And I think just adds a lot of depth to the story of the Apothecary Diaries as a whole, because yes, while Maomao is undeniably a genius, she is also a real person coming from a real place and had this very full, dynamic, intricate life before she came to the Rear Palace. And this whole mystery really just speaks to the shared experience of women across social class. I also think it's really interesting to see Gyokyo and Jinshi's reactions to Maomao's explanation, with Gyokyo again really reiterating the type of person that she is as being somebody who is open-minded, somebody who is open to new knowledge regardless of where it comes from. It's made very clear that Gyokyo doesn't particularly care about like the unnecessary kind of frills and propriety of social class, because she herself says, I should have been more careful after my baby's nurse got sick from using that same powder, and Gyokyo gave her time off, fully compensated, which showcases even more of Gyokyo's character and the type of person that she is. We also learned that Gyokyo tried to go and warn Li Hua after getting Maomao's warning, but because of being sick, exhausted, and just being convinced that Gyokyo had something to do with it, everything that Li Hua was hearing coming out of Gyokyo's mouth just sounded like sabotage. And along with Gyokyo recognizing her own responsibility and how she should have been more careful, Jinshi also recognizes his as manager of the rear palace and says that I also should have been more observant and more careful because then we could have avoided this needless death. And then after all of this, Maomao asks the question, what are you intending to do with me now that you know everything? And this is when we learn that Gyokyo has decided to have Maomao join her service as her lady in waiting, which, according to the narrator, is an unheard of promotion for somebody so young who has just started off in the rear palace like Maomao has. And while in theory this is a wonderful thing to happen to anybody and something that I think most servants would be very excited about the prospect of, Maomao is like, this is not good. This is the antithesis of everything that I wanted to do. And so we now get to watch in subsequent episodes as Maomao reaps the consequences of her own actions. Overall, really great episode, so jam-packed with so much information, and really does just set the stage for what the rest of the story is going to look like. Moving on to episode 2, titled Chilly Apothecary. This episode opens with the mystery that we are going to be tackling, which is soldiers all around a campfire in an unknown village suddenly collapsing around a fire with no explanation, though the suspect seems to be poisoning. We also get a shot of a mysterious woman that becomes more relevant in the next episode. Then we cut to a conversation between Jinshi and Gaoxuan where they are talking about Lady Lihua and Gyokyo, specifically the differences in the ways in which their pavilions are staffed. Because even though they are both high-ranking concubines and have a very similar status, Lady Gyokyo only has 4 ladies in waiting working for her, whereas Lady Lihua has 10 plus. And Jinshi suggests that this massive discrepancy in staffing numbers could potentially hurt Gyokyo's pride as a concubine. However, Gaoxuan argues that there really isn't any reason for Gyokyo's pride to be hurt because she has other strengths that really set her apart from the other concubines, and describes her as being warm and gentle whilst also being intelligent and having discernment. Now, from this exchange, what we get as viewers is that Gyokyo is far more picky about who she staffs than Lihua and just seems to be far more involved with the way that her pavilion runs. Because Jinshi states that Gyokyo never employs anybody unless she knows everything about them because she is really big on trust and loyalty. Which, keeping that in mind, that makes Gyokyo hiring Maomao to be quite a radical thing for her to do, considering the fact that she knows nothing about her when she hires her, aside from the fact that she is a servant girl who happens to be intelligent and perceptive with a knowledge of medicine and solved a mystery that saved her daughter's life. And as mentioned before, the narrator at the end of that episode points out that this type of promotion is very unprecedented. So keeping all of that in mind, plus Gaoxuan talking about how intelligent Gyokyo is, suggests that she is discernibly different from her peers of a similar social status, and that also sets her apart compared to the other concubines in the rear palace who, based on this conversation between Gaoxuan and Jinshi, might not have hired Maomao in the way that Gyokyo did. Now, this insight and the differences between these two women and their respective pavilions becomes really important in the story going forward, and I appreciate that we start to see, the foundation for that being set in these earlier episodes. That's something that I really do enjoy about the Apothecary Diaries, is that you will have a lot of things set up very early on that gradually get more and more unfurled as the episodes progress. And the topic of Lihua and Gyokyo's pavilions is an important one in this first season in the ways in which it impacts not only the working environment but also the lives of the concubines. And then we get some more insight from Jinshi on just life in general in the rear palace, which calls back to what Maomao mentions in episode 1, which is the fact that standing out here, dangerous. Also, the way to survive in the rear palace is to be wary of everybody, aside from the people that work for you directly under you. And again, that further reinforces the fact that Gyokyo deciding to hire Maomao off a whim is a really radical, sudden move that doesn't necessarily, fall in line with the ways in which you are supposed to be smart and savvy in the rear palace, which also suggests Maomao is exceptional. Because despite the fact that Gyokyo doesn't know her very well, she recognizes the advantage of having Maomao in her service. Speaking of Maomao, we now get to hear what Jinshi's intentions are with her as he is talking to Gaoxuan in this conversation, where he decides that Maomao is the perfect pawn, the perfect tool, somebody that he should put to good use because her talents and knowledge would be absolutely wasted just doing laundry, which he is not wrong about. But Gaoxuan also very rationally points out the fact that, hey, you don't know this person, and also what if she uses that knowledge of poison and medicine against you? And this initial interaction between these two men gives us some insight into the role that Gaoshun serves in this dynamic, which is essentially to kind of rein in Jinshi's maybe more out there ideas, and also just to maintain a kind of level head and be a voice of reason when Jinshi might be getting a little bit ambitious with his ideas and seems to not be necessarily thinking through everything that he is planning to do. Essentially, he is there to babysit and keep Jinshi's antics under control. And Jinshi is not worried about this whatsoever and decides that he will just seduce her a little bit to ensure that she stays in line. Rewatching this especially is very funny when you know how Maomao is going to react to Jinshi's supposed charm. But I also think it's a very interesting moment because it showcases the ways in which Jinshi views his looks, in the way that he articulates them being this tool, especially when you consider where he is working, in this enclosed space where there are no men aside from eunuchs, obviously, but women that are not necessarily getting attention from men because they're all supposed to be loyal to the emperor, and kind of being a handsome man in the midst of all of this, in the midst of these attention deprived women who do not have men flirting with them on the regular. Like, that's a lot of power. And then we get to see Jinshi try to seduce Maomao as he goes to send her off to the Jade Pavilion where she is going to be working and living from now on, and how she is kind of just like, what are you doing here? Why do you have all this free time? And it is no surprise that this strategy does not work well on somebody like Maomao when we consider where she grew up. She grew up in the pleasure district around brothels, in the kind of epicenter of men, and varying types of man, charming men, gross men, men that lie, men that are truthful. Like, Maomao has grown up around all sorts. And somebody like that is not going to be charmed or wooed by any of this stuff because she knows what men are like. She is intimately, acutely aware of what men are like in a way that a lot of these women are not, because these are chaste girls that come into the rear palace that also don't really get taught about sex or intimacy, as we see later on in the story. And for a girl like that, with all these whimsy kind of romantic notions about men and life and romance in general, are going to be wooed by somebody like Jinshi. But in the case of Maomao, it's not working, because she is not going to hold on to any of these kind of fantasized, romanticized delusions of men, because she has seen men. Then we cut to Maomao arriving at the Jade Pavilion, her new place of employment, and meeting Hongyang, the head lady in waiting. The first thing we learn about the Jade Pavilion is that it is massive. And this is something that we continue to see as Maomao goes to more and more pavilions as the story progresses. And that pavilions, beyond just being these kind of massive homes, are almost like their own mini estates with, again, the massive home, but also gardens, also separate baths. Like, they're big. And then we go and meet the ladies in waiting. And including Hongyang, there are only 4 of them, and there is no servant girls. So it is a very close, tight-knit group of women. And we see how there is no kind of resentment or frustration from any of these ladies in waiting at the fact that they are doing the work that most other concubines have like 10 plus people to do, along with serving girls, right? So like they'll have 10 plus ladies in waiting, and then they'll also have servant girls that do work. But here you've just got these 4 ladies in waiting, but they are very happy to do it. As one of them points out, we want to make sure that Lady Gyokyo is comfortable. You see that there is this real affection and affinity for their mistress, where it's clear to see that they would do anything for Gyokyo. They are dedicated, they are loyal, but they are also incredibly kind. And we see this in the way that the 3 of them look at Maomao's bandaged arm and immediately get looks of concern on their face and tell her to go rest because she has a job to do later. And all while they're doing this, they just look so incredibly concerned and empathetic. Granted, they are also being a little bit over dramatic and theatrical and very much jumping to conclusions, assuming that Maomao was abused at home, hence the reason that she's all bandaged up. Little do they know it is her own doing. And I think what's really fun about this initial kind of interaction at the Jade Pavilion is just how many innocent misunderstandings are happening here. You have Gyokyo's ladies in waiting being very well intentioned, but also incredibly off base about the context of Maomao's bandages and just her life in general, and also making assumptions about how Maomao is going to feel about her upcoming role at the pavilion. And then you have Maomao taking their concern and their wanting her to rest as this initial rejection of her. And she assumes that, oh, for a group of people that are so tight knit, of course, an outsider is not going to be welcomed right away. And that's why she assumes that she is being sent to her room. And I think this is a good example of how Maomao's perspective colors the story when she is narrating it. And that while she can have fair assessments about some things, she can also have these types of assessments where she is kind of assuming lesser of people than maybe she should be. But at the same time, given the kind of politics that we have been enlightened to about the Rear Palace, it is not that surprising for Maomao to assume that they might be a little bit wary of outsiders, because as Jinshi articulates in his conversation with Gaoshun earlier in this episode, the way that you survive here is by not trusting people super easily. So it would only be natural for a group of ladies in waiting who are so tight knit, where there is literally only 3 of them plus the head lady in waiting, to be, a little bit wary of new people coming in. And then we cut to Maomao finally finding out what her new role is here at the Jade Pavilion, and it is being Lady Gyokyo's poison taster. Now, it will never not be incredibly endearing and lovely to see how Maomao cannot hold back her excitement at essentially being given her dream job, and how she is really trying to check herself and not look so enthusiastic and show her hand too much. And we also get insight here about the use of poison in the Rear Palace, which is not surprising given the fact that it is a decidedly unviolent way to deal with people, where getting into an all-out brawl or physical altercation would not be ideal, considering the fact that this is a place that is heavily guarded. It is a gilded cage. You cannot escape after unaliving somebody. So it makes sense to go with this kind of very nondescript covert route of poisoning. And Jinshi articulates to Maomao that when Gyokyo was pregnant with her daughter, her food was poisoned at least twice. So they're not sure exactly how many times this happened, but at least twice that they know of. And obviously with this new role designation, Maomao puts 2 and 2 together and realizes that this is why Gyokyo's ladies in waiting were looking at her with so much sympathy, because this is a role that for most people would be really terrifying. And that is why Jinshi is so confused seeing Maomao, despite her best efforts, still being really overtly enthusiastic about it, because this is not something that most poison tasters are enthusiastic about, especially considering the fate of Gyokyo's last poison taster, who still cannot use her legs because the poison paralyzed her. And this is kind of Jinshi and Gyokyo's first introduction into Maomao's eccentric nature. Later that night, we cut to Maomao having a conversation with Hongyang, where she is providing Hongyang with some feedback, saying, hey, just so you know, maybe serve the food in silver instead of ceramic, because the food that they placed in front of Maomao for this initial tasting was in ceramic bowls. And Hongyang looks very satisfied with this and is like, oh, okay, so Jinshi was right. You are skilled, because he made us intentionally put them in ceramic instead of silver to test you, which Maomao is not happy about. But it also lets her know that beyond just being this kind of silly flirt that seems to have a lot of time on his hands, Jinshi is also somebody who is smart and cunning and wanted to test and see if Maomao was actually capable of doing this job. And it also confirms to him that she is knowledgeable not only about medicine, but poison. And then we get to one of my favorite interactions that Maomao and Hongyang have, where she asks Maomao, you are literate and you could have gotten a higher pay if you had disclosed your literacy, so why didn't you? And Maomao brings up her very valid reason for not, which is that she was kidnapped and brought into the Rear Palace. So any of her earnings, the chunk of her earnings that go to her family, don't actually go to her family. And if she had disclosed that she was literate, she would have gotten a higher pay, which meant more money for her kidnappers. And Hongyang thinks about this for a moment, and then she's like, oh, so you're telling me that in an effort to make sure that your kidnappers were not rewarded extra, you took a pay cut at your own expense as well? And Maomao's like, yeah. And Hongyang's like, okay. And then she picks up a vase, seems to be handing it to Maomao, and then just drops it before Maomao can even grab it, leaving Maomao stunned. And she's like, what is going on here? And then Hongyang proceeds to say, oh dear, you dropped this vase, this very expensive vase that I will now have to charge your family for. And it was really expensive, so they're probably not going to get any of your earnings for a while. One thing about Hongyang, she is slick, she is clever. And I think that Maomao's response to this, as she is walking out and going to her room for the night, is also very interesting, where she is like, oh wow, Hongyang really knows how to motivate her workers, which makes sense. But I think it starts this pattern that you start to see of Maomao perceiving things in maybe a more transactional way than other people might. Whereas I think somebody else might have noted that that was very kind, very thoughtful of Hongyang to do, as an act of solidarity, if you will. Maomao is like, oh yeah, great boss, knows how to get labor out of people. Which again, this makes sense when you consider, the fact that Maomao grew up around old granny, who is a businesswoman first before she is anything else. But I do think it's interesting. I think it is interesting to note, and it comes up again in the season later. Then we cut to the next day, where we get insight into what Maomao's day-to-day looks like as a poison taster, and we see that for somebody who is as industrious as her, somebody who actually does want to be doing things, is incredibly bored, because the routine of a poison taster is essentially just, coming out 3 times a day to taste some meals, and that's it. And because the ladies in waiting are so sympathetic to the fact that she has to do this, they don't want her doing any other labor. They're like, no, you don't need to help us with cleaning, with anything, because you have a tough job. And as she is in the throes of boredom, who calls upon her with a request? None other than Jinshi. So Maomao goes to see him in the Jade Pavilion's kind of main drawing room, and Gyokyo is also there, along with her ladies in waiting. And once again, we see Jinshi trying to use his charms on her and finding that they very much don't work. If anything, they make her very, very visibly repulsed by him. Beyond this being just funny, it's so interesting to see how Maomao has thrown this massive wrench in Jinshi's strategy, where he literally point blank asks her, how come you're immune? Because he looks at Maomao, she's got this ooh look on her face, and then he turns and looks at Gyokyo's ladies in waiting, and they're all giggly, there's hearts coming out, they're having a great time. And then he turns back to Maomao, and again, repulsion. And my favorite part of this moment is watching Gyokyo's head go back and forth between Maomao and her ladies in waiting as she starts to realize something is going on here. And just seeing her confused as she's trying to discern what's happening here, I think it's a really great scene piece to include, especially later when we learn how much Gyokyo loves gossip, and how this particular dynamic between Maomao and Jinshi very much fuels her love for gossip and keeps her very entertained. And in this way, Gyokyo almost feels like an audience insert, like she is us. If I was in the Apothecary Diaries, I would be Gyokyo. I would be the one so intrigued by this dynamic, so thoroughly entertained by this dynamic, wanting to instigate situations where I got to see this dynamic. She almost feels like an audience stand-in, and I think it's really lovely. And then we get to the reason that Jinshi has summoned Maomao, which is to present her with some bao buns. And upon opening these steaming bao buns and looking at the filling and smelling them, Maomao's like, oh, there's an aphrodisiac in this, babe. Which Jinshi is very impressed by. He's like, you can tell just by smelling them. And she's like, yeah, I can. Jinshi also makes it clear that these have come from somebody who he very much would not want to eat these in the company of. And this gives us some insight into, the implications that Jinshi's looks have on his day-to-day living in terms of the often unwanted attention that he attracts. And then he goes into the real reason that he has summoned her here, which is to ask her about the first scene that we see in this episode, the soldiers suddenly collapsing all around the fire, and how this is being attributed to poison. Jinshi also lets Maomao know that currently the head of the village that the soldiers were staying in is being blamed for this. However, he has not been executed because another soldier is important to keep in mind, de-escalated the situation, was like, let's wait and investigate a little more before we annihilate a village for allegedly being aligned with the barbarians that were fighting. And after thinking for a little bit and asking Jinshi some questions about, the utensils the soldiers were using, they were using their own, and about where they were, which Jinshi points out outside, there was probably a fire because they were set up for camp. Maomao's like, oh, fire, camp, would. And from this line of questioning, Maomao discerns a potential reason as to why this happened. And this is the first time that we really see Maomao using conjecture and being a little bit presumptuous based on the kind of incomplete information that she has, which is something that Lomin, you will see later, her father, discourages her from doing. He's like, don't just start coming up with things before you have kind of the full picture and before you have, more evidence in front of you. But Maomao goes on to illustrate what she is thinking to Gyokyo and Jinshi by going up to a rhododendron plant that is in the drawing room and munching on it. And Gyokyo's like, oh, does that taste good? And Maomao's like, no, it doesn't, but it's poisonous. Which Gyokyo and Jinshi are like, what? And she's like, yeah, it can make you quite nauseous and sick, but it's also something that is used, as display because the flowers are beautiful. And her point here is that even things that are very unassuming, that could just be there for decoration, that could be there for any number of reasons, can also double as poison. And Maomao suggests that potentially the wood that was being burned by these soldiers at their camps could have been releasing something into the air that caused these soldiers to pass out. And this idea of, unsuspecting, inconspicuous things also doubling as, poison and agents for creating poisons is something that is going to come up later in the series as well. And I appreciate that they're kind of laying the groundwork for this idea of unsuspecting things also doubling as poison. And then we get the final part of Jinshi's demands for Maomao in this discussion, which is to create an aphrodisiac for him. And again, we see Maomao really trying to hold back her glee at the prospect of getting to make medicine, which is again something that she very much enjoys doing. And she's like, yeah, for sure, with the right ingredients, I could definitely do that for you, babe. After this, we see Jinshi and Gaoxuan leaving to go back to Jinshi's office, and they run into a concubine who opens her door as they're passing by, her living quarters, and she's like, oh, Master Jinshi, do you maybe want to, come in for some tea? And this further showcases the ways in which Jinshi's looks serve a function in the rear palace, as they act as a test, as Gaoxuan puts it, to test the loyalty of the concubines, to ensure that even if they are not being visited by the emperor, even if they are still chaste, that they are loyal to the emperor. And any concubine that is inviting any man into her quarters, eunuch or not, is not loyal to the emperor, which Gaoxuan thinks is quite crafty of the emperor to have Jinshi here to act as this test for these women. And then Jinshi talks to Gaoxuan about the absolute glee that he feels at the fact that Maomao does not look at him with that type of kind of doe-eyed reverence that this concubine was looking at him with when she was inviting him in for tea. Maomao looks at him like he is an insect. And some key things that I kind of take away as a viewer from seeing Jinshi react this way to Maomao's reaction to him is that, one, he's young and silly, and that two, while this is not an uncommon trope in fiction to, have a character react in an unconventional way to a character that other people seem to very much adore, but I think that in the case of the Apothecary Diaries, it adds a lot of depth to the story because it is part of kind of a larger rift that Maomao creates with her presence, where she gets hired by a concubine who is notoriously picky with who she staffs just on the basis of her intelligence, her perception, and her potential resourcefulness. And she is also somebody who does not fall for Jinshi's charms in the way that basically everyone else in the rear palace does. Maomao is really interesting as far as her kind of addition to this environment goes because she is so unpredictable. She is somebody that brings this level of instability to a place that has had very clear precedents and rules for a very long time. But in many ways, Maomao actively defies these things. And that becomes, even more apparent when we learn about her true lineage and where she comes from. And so I think that while this is a trope that we have seen time and time again, where, a main girl is not particularly charmed or enticed by a male character, it works really well here because it's tied into this kind of bigger picture, this bigger story that we are seeing unfold as we see how, this character brings so much disruption to this place that has had a very clear order for a very long time. And then the next day, we see Maomao and Gaoxuan making their way over to the quack doctor's office/clinic to get ingredients to make this aphrodisiac. And again, we see how Maomao cannot hold back her enthusiasm, no matter how hard she tries to not show her hand, and does a dance. She does a little dance. And then she gathers her ingredients. And I think it's really interesting to see the way that the quack doctor initially reacts to her in this scene where he's just kind of like, what is this girl doing on my turf? And how that changes as the story progresses. And what aphrodisiac is Maomao making? She is making chocolate, a classic, and she has some stuff left over. So of course, Maomao being Maomao, loving food, loving a good snack, makes herself a little something to eat later. But unfortunately, some other people get into it while Maomao is out very enthusiastically picking a bunch of herbs because the rear palace seems to just have an abundance of medicinal herbs planted all over the place. Gee, I wonder why that is. And we learn that through these ladies in waiting sneaking a part of Maomao's snack that the aphrodisiac does in fact work. And I think Maomao's reaction to coming back and seeing this scene also showcases how her presence is really disruptive because her reaction is just to look under their clothes and be like, oh good, they didn't go all the way. To which Hongyang obviously understandably smacks her in the head because she's like, what have you done with my girls? That I think that this reaction is very kind of par for the course for somebody like Maomao who has grown up surrounded by brothels. Like sex and intimacy is not a new thing to her. She stays states in a very matter-of-fact way that they didn't go all the way. And I just think that's very interesting and very clearly showcases how Maomao is a product of the environment that she grew up in, where she has this very nonchalant view of sex. And then we get our first kind of proper assembly of the crew, because Gaoshun was not there the first time, Jinshi summons Maomao to the Jade Pavilion earlier in this episode. I call it the crew because it's one of my favorite things about this first season of the Apothecary Diaries is seeing Jinshi, Maomao, Gyokyo, Hongyang, sometimes Gyokyo's other ladies in waiting, and Gaoshun all in the drawing room of the Jade Pavilion, because it is just so fun to see the dynamics playing out. So initially in this meeting, we see that, Maomao and her kind of reaction to all of this and just what happened is quite the culture shock for all of these kind of high-born people, especially after they find out that what the girls had eaten was not actually the aphrodisiac that Maomao had prepared for Jinshi, like the chocolate-covered items. It was a separate snack that Maomao had made for herself, and they are shocked. They're like, why would you eat this? And Mama's like, well, when you're used to stimulants like this, when you're used to alcohol, when you're used to these things, it doesn't really affect you. Which obviously these chaste girls, these girls that have grown up, in this type of propriety are not used to. It's almost like a little play every single time they all get together like this. Like when the crew is together like this, it almost feels like its own separate short. Like it could be its own kind of detached short story from the rest of the Apothecary Diaries, because it is a very similar play by play. It's Maomao kind of doing something that is a bit unusual, a little bit out of the ordinary or exceptional, and them all kind of subsequently being surprised by whatever she has said or done, and then Jinshi wanting to join in on her chaos, and obviously Gaoshun and Hongyang jumping in to be like, absolutely not, like you are not getting on this train. Case in point in this scene where Jinshi is like, oh, I should eat one of these snacks then. And then they're both like, we beg to differ. Like, you absolutely should not do that. And then just Gyokyo watching everything unfold and laughing and just having a great time being entertained by a play, essentially. Like, she's getting a show. Like, every other day, Gyokyo gets a show in the Rear Palace because of these two. However, I will say that Gaoshun and Hongyang are making a very good point in this scene, because their rationale is just that, if this aphrodisiac does have an effect on Jinshi, it would not be good for anybody to come across him in this state, because they are already ready to bend over backwards and to really do anything with him and to him when he is completely sober and in his right mind. So imagine if he was in a state where maybe he was a little bit inclined to engage. And I think that Mama's internal dialogue also showcases another thing about Gyokyo. A lot of these episodes initially are learning a lot about Gyokyo, which I love because I love Gyokyo. But Maomao talks about how, Jinshi making this joke, because when he says, no, I'm not going to, eat this, obviously I was just joking about eating this snack. Maomao points out that this is a very distasteful joke to make, like a very lewd kind of joke to make in front of an emperor's concubine. And Gyokyo does not seem affected by it at all. She is laughing up a storm. She's having a great time with all of this, which suggests a couple things potentially about Gyokyo that we're learning here, which is that she's just kind of open-minded. She doesn't necessarily care for all of the social proprieties that exist in their world, or also that, she is very comfortable with Jinshi and that they have a very good kind of rapport and camaraderie happening here, where him making a joke like that is not something that would make Gyokyo uncomfortable or feel inappropriate. Gyokyo is just so fun. It is so fun seeing somebody who is good at their job and intelligent and discerning, but also doesn't take themselves too seriously. Also, something that I think does not get talked about enough about this scene that I think is so funny is the insight that we get into Gyokyo and the Emperor's intimate life, because Gyokyo suggests to Maomao to, maybe make some of these little chocolates for her to give to the Emperor to keep things lively in the bedroom. And Maomao is like, oh, it would have to be like 3 times more potent than the tonic that he currently takes. So we learn here that the Emperor takes a tonic to kind of help him maintain his vigor in the bedroom, which, fair enough, you got a lot of women on the roster, and that probably requires, a lot of energy to do that on a consistent basis with multiple people. And in response to Maomao saying that it would have to be 3 times as strong, Gyokyo turns blue and is like, oh, 3 times as strong? Never mind. We will just stick to the tonic. And then this gets funnier as we get into subsequent episodes in season 1, where we learn that our poor girl is getting wrung out. And then finally, this episode ends with seeing a mysterious woman on the wall of the Rear Palace spooking a servant girl. Now, out of these 3 episodes, episode 3 is definitely my favorite of the roster, and it's titled The Unsettling Matter of the Spirit. Mostly because it sets up a lot of ideas that are going to be very poignant and important in the story going forward, and you get a lot of of fun character moments in this one. So this episode opens with Jinshi talking to what looks like another concubine, and her ladies in waiting are reacting to whatever Jinshi has just said by saying that, there must be some mistake, a reward? And then we cut back to the Jade Pavilion and see Gyokyo's ladies in waiting going about their business and their regular duties, their many regular duties, because again, there are only 4 of them. And they're just chatting about the difference in weather, how they've been in the capital for a while, but it is hard to get used to how chilly it is here compared to the sand and sunshine of their hometown in the western capital. And this is where we learn that all of Gyokyo's other ladies in waiting, aside from Maomao, are from where she's from. And we also get some insight into the role that concubines play beyond just, warming the emperor's bed and popping out babies for him, because Ailan, one of the ladies in waiting, talks about how she's recently gotten news from her father stating that, trade between the capital city in the west and the capital here has been going really well and has been growing. And Yinghua responds with, of course that would be the case, because, the western capital is the emperor's favorite concubine's homeland, and that the central officers cannot ignore that fact when they are talking about trade. And this conversation highlights the political consequences that come with being a concubine and the work that you are often expected to do, beyond the fact that Gyokyo is supposed to provide companionship, entertainment, and, be there for the emperor to fulfill his needs and pop out his children. She is also there to represent her family, to represent the western capital, to advocate for her homeland, and to advocate for her family's interests in subtle ways. And we see how that comes to fruition in cases like this, where trade between the kind of capital city in the west and the capital city here is on the rise, and that is one of the big reasons that families even send their daughters into the rear palace in the first place. And we also see in this conversation just how close these ladies in waiting are and how much they love and care about each other, and also how much they care about Maomao, because when Yinghua goes into the kitchen to clean, Maomao is there making some cold medication, and she tells Maomao, after seeing her bandages again and being reminded of this supposed narrative of Maomao being, a victim of abuse, that, if anyone ever bothers her, Maomao can come to Yinghua and she will deal with it. And they're so lovely. I have such a soft spot for Gyokyo staff because it is just such a warm, cozy, and welcoming environment. And along with assuring Maomao that she will be there for her if anyone tries to bother her, Yinghua also talks to her about the rumor that's been going around in the rear palace that there is a ghost that comes out at night and dances on the palace walls. This obviously sparks Maomao's attention, and she has to go do research. And where does she go do that research? She goes to Shaolan. It is very funny to see how Shaolan is essentially like Maomao's library. She is Maomao's way of understanding what the kind of happenings are in the rear palace, because again, Maomao is not paying attention to things. Not paying attention to things that aren't related to medicine or poison, I think is a more accurate way of phrasing this. And in this conversation, we also get insight into the ways in which the rear palace is essentially a gilded cage, because Maomao describes how, it's completely caged in. She uses that exact vernacular of 4 walls. They're high. There are always guards standing outside the gates that each of these walls have. And there is also a moat that encircles this area. And there are, talks and rumors of how the moat at the bottom is kind of littered with the bodies of past concubines that have tried to escape to no avail, because it is a very difficult, next to impossible place to get out of once you are inside. And then we cut to Maomao going to the quack doctor's office/clinic to make some medicine. And this is where we see that the rapport, the dynamic between them has changed quite significantly since she first went there to get aphrodisiac ingredients, because the quack realized that because Maomao can make medicine, she's actually quite useful to him. And I enjoy their dynamic quite a bit. It's not like a super significant major part of the story by any means, but I think it is very fun to see just how opposite they are on the spectrums, where you have this kind of like well-meaning, kind, bumbling fool, and Maomao, who's incredibly sharp and perceptive and just leagues more skilled and intelligent when it comes to medicine. And then, of course, because we can never go too long without running into him, Jinshi shows up at the clinic to talk to Maomao. I find these earlier interactions between them to be so funny, because so much of it is just Maomao pondering in her internal dialogue as to why this man has so much time. She's like, why does he have so much free time? Does he not have better things to do? And then as the series progresses, you you learn that Jinshi, in fact, does not have this free time. He is not a guy with a lot of free time. He is constantly working. So he is very much going out of his way, despite the fact that he has better things to do because he wants to see Maomao. It's also very fun in this scene to watch Maomao's kind of gears turning, trying to figure out why Jinshi is always just kind of casually traipsing around the rear palace, because eunuchs are typically kind of stationed in the domestic service department, and Maomao kind of deduces from this that like, oh, the fact that he just traipses around so freely and he's not in like a central building unless he's needed to be somewhere otherwise, that he likely outranks the matron of the serving women, which is kind of the head honcho, if you will, of the rear palace, who kind of manages a lot of what's happening on the day to day. And then quite hilariously, after making all of these very logical deductions based on the information presented to her, Maomao is like, oh, maybe he's just the emperor's favorite, if you know what I mean. And I think this is part of what makes Maomao so endearing. Because while, yes, she is undeniably intelligent in this way that can create a barrier between her and kind of quote unquote regular people, that every once in a while she will toss in like a very silly thought or silly theory that really reminds you as a viewer that, you know, as intelligent as she is not this detached robot. Especially when you compare her to other genius-like characters who use deductive reasoning to solve mysteries, who can come across very cold and detached. I would argue that Maomao is anything but. Don't get me wrong, she definitely tries. She makes a very valiant effort to be detached, to be cold, to mind her own business, but she very much routinely fails to not care about the people and the injustices happening around her, and very much cannot help interfering and getting involved in situations that she knows, logically speaking, are not necessarily optimal for her to get involved in, because her life would be much easier otherwise. And later on in the story, Maomao gets involved in situations that, beyond maybe being potentially mildly inconvenient to her, could actually be very much to her detriment in a serious way. Anyways, then Jinshi goes into what he came here to ask Maomao, which is what she thinks about this ghostly woman situation and her knowledge about sleepwalking specifically. And obviously this catches Maomao's attention because it's an ailment, it's related to the field of health and medicine, but she also lets Jinshi know that she has no idea how it would be cured, because it's not something that you would cure with like a medicine you're making with like herbs and stuff. So it just seems to be out of her scope as an apothecary. However, when Jinshi presses her for any kind of alternative lines of thinking, or if she happens to know anything else, or if she can look into anything else, Maomao eventually caves and says, if I find anything, I'll let you know. And she also describes how Jinshi sticks to you like a sparkly leech. And so with this sparkly leechness that Jinshi demonstrates, we cue to Maomao and Gaoxuan walking around the grounds of the rear palace at night to go and investigate this situation and to watch this mysterious ghost woman on the walls. This interaction is a lot of fun, in my opinion, because first you see Maomao calling Maomao Lady Maomao, to which Maomao goes, you likely unrank me, like there is no need to preface my name with that title. And then Gaoxuan takes like a very sharp turn and decides that he is going to call her Xiao Mao, which means little Mao, very much like a term of endearment, and maybe something that suggests more familiarity than they actually have at this moment, which is why Maomao in her internal dialogue is like, that was really set in. And it's just funny because Gaoxuan so far has come across as like, you know, this kind of like cold conservative guy who's very much there to do his job, is very rational about the way that he sees things, and for him to turn around and be like, oh, hello, little Mao. This is very funny. And this is also where we have Gaoxuan telling Maomao to please not glare at Jinshi, because he had to listen to Jinshi afterwards talking about how riveting it was to be looked at like a mere insect, and how he doesn't think that, you know, Maomao doing this is particularly helpful because Jinshi just gets a little too excited and he's got work to do. And then at long last, we meet concubine Fuyo, who is up there supposedly sleepwalking, dancing on the top of the walls of the rear palace, and Maomao notes that she looks really beautiful. And then we cut to being back with the quack doctor, where he is kind of providing a bit of background on Fuyo. She's been at the rear palace for 2 years. She is a mid-ranking concubine, and she is a very skilled dancer. However, the first time the emperor ever came to visit her, she was supposed to dance for him, and she ended up tripping and falling over. And after that, the emperor left, never touched her, and has never visited her since. And we also learned that she is a princess from a small vassal state. A vassal state is essentially, from my understanding, an area that has its own independence in terms of its internal affairs, its governance, how it runs, but it is still a state that has to answer to a kind of more dominant, superior power. In this case, concubine Fuyo's vassal state answers to the country of Li. And we also learn that the quack doctor and other concubines in the rear palace all seem to assume that Fuyo is not happy about this, hence the reason, she's sleepwalking, because this is not ideal for, this princess that's from this kind of unknown place to have to be rewarded to a military officer like this and have no say in where she is going. And most notably, the quack doctor says she probably won't want to go back there. And Mama's like, wait a minute, you're telling me the military officer she's being rewarded to is from the same vassal state that Fuyo is from? And then we see Maomao and Gao Xuan kind of just crouching next to the window of Fuyo's residence and just kind of seeing her during the day. And Maomao notes that she is very much like the Fuyo flower that she is named for, this flower that is white during the day and then turns this dark, kind of stunning pink at night. This flower that can change its appearance from day to night, which is very much how they would describe Fuyo. She looks very reserved, unassuming, quiet, shy, timid, and then at night she is this kind of larger than life, almost whimsical dancer on the tops of these walls. And we also learned that she moved from dancing on the north wall to dancing on the east wall. So based on all of this information that Maomao has gathered about the kind of similar area that both of these individuals are from and Fuyo's kind of whole sleepwalking situation, she comes up with a theory. And while she is kind of pondering this idea, she is looking at her own pinky finger, which has a small chunk missing from it. Cue us being back in the Jade Pavilion with the crew, and Maomao is explaining her theory to everybody there. She starts off by talking about an experience that she had in the Pleasure District where there was a courtesan who was very cheerful, really skilled at poetry, who got a purchasing offer from this very wealthy merchant. However, this merchant also was very old and had a wife and had kids and had grandkids. And after this kind of offer was set in stone, this courtesan started to sleepwalk. So she would kind of roam the brothel at night. It was very disconcerting. And because of that, this offer ended up becoming rescinded. And then after it was rescinded, suddenly her sleepwalking stopped. And Maomao notes that this courtesan also only had 1 year left on her contract before she would be free from the brothel, whether she was purchased or not. And so Gyokyo, being intelligent and perceptive, asks, oh, so was this a case where this courtesan just simply did not want to be bought out by this person and then therefore took steps to prevent that from happening to her? And Maomao says, yeah, that is entirely possible. And Maomao suggests that Fuyo might be doing the same thing here, where she is actively trying to lower her value as a concubine, making it make more sense to, give her away as a reward to a military officer. And then Jinshi jumps in and asks Maomao, oh, so this is what you think is happening? And she's like, yeah, I think so. And Jinshi's like, are you sure? Teasing her. And Maomao is not happy about this. And it's very funny because you just see Gao Xuan behind Jinshi being like, please hold it in. Don't give him the look that I specifically told you not to give him. This is another kind of combination that you see from the Jade Pavilion crew, which is Jinshi irritating Maomao, Maomao being irritated, Gao Xuan trying to kind of diffuse the situation so that Jinshi doesn't get more joy out of this than he already is, distracting him from his work later. Gyokyo being thoroughly entertained, and Hongyang just looking very exasperated at the theatrics happening here. Now, after Maomao has presented this idea, the steps that are taken is that Fuyo is essentially put under house arrest until the day of her bestowal to this military officer. And this is another very interesting part of this episode, which is that over the next couple of days, as the days are kind of going by and the bestowal date is coming up, Gyokyo notices that Maomao is acting off, and she asks Hongyang, she's like, do you think Maomao has been acting a little bit, strange lately? And Hongyang hasn't noticed anything, even though Hongyang is the one who interacts with these ladies in waiting on a much more frequent basis. She's technically in charge of them. She works with them. She doesn't notice, but Gyokyo notices. One, I think this just showcases how perceptive Gyokyo is, but also just how much she sincerely cares, because frankly, Gyokyo does not have to notice when things are off with her ladies in waiting and with her other staff. She is not under any obligation. It could very much be considered something that is below her station as far as concerns go, because this is really Hongyang's territory. But she notices. And even though she also doesn't have to do this, earlier in the day before they're going to go watch the bestowal, Gyokyo asks Maomao, is everything okay? And Maoma's like, yeah, everything is fine. And then when they're actually at the bestowal and they're watching as Fuyo kind of gets ready to leave the rear palace, Gyokyo says to Maomao that, you can tell me things, right? I'm not going to get mad because I'm the one that asked you what's wrong. So please feel free to tell me what's up, because I know that something is up. And Maomao is like, yeah, for sure. Let me tell you, I'm just going to say this is all conjecture. So let's just keep this between us. And Gyokyo's like, yes, of course, because Maomao understands the implications that this could have if like people figure out this is what Fuyo was doing. But essentially, Maomao articulates another instance of a similar thing happening in the Pleasure District, where there was a courtesan who also started sleepwalking after kind of negotiations were being made for her to be bought out by somebody that it seems like she didn't want to be bought out by, because as soon as those negotiations fell through, she stopped sleepwalking. But the kind of consequence of this was that her value went down because she was considered ill. And so a little while later, this courtesan got another offer from somebody at a much lower rate. And it turns out that she knew this person from before. And so what was revealed in all of this is that it was actually a ruse. This courtesan purposefully started to sleepwalk in order to ensure that this offer would fall through and her value would go down, so that somebody that she actually wanted to buy her out could afford to buy her out. And then Maomao tells Gyokyo about the information that she learned about how this military officer that has asked for Fuyo is somebody who is not only from the vassal state that she is from, but was also childhood friends with her. But he knew that because of his social station, he would never be able to propose marriage to a princess. And so this is a way that they have found to get around those normal circumstances by having him get Fuyo as a reward for showcasing valor in the field. Because he is the military officer that de-escalated the situation between the soldiers and the villagers when, there was this kind of suspicion that the villagers had poisoned the officers, and that's why they were all collapsing. The mystery from last episode. And the reason that Maomao is quite hesitant to tell Gyokyo this and insist that this stay between them is that obviously the fact that a concubine conspired to get out of the rear palace would not be looked upon well if this were to get out, and this could have really serious consequences for Fuyo and also for this military officer. And then we get one of my favorite moments from season 1, because I think it is such a lovely example of how you can have these little moments that when we're looking at kind of the greater narrative are not particularly significant, but have a huge impact. Because the amount of times that I have seen edits of this reunion between Fuyo and her childhood friend, this military officer. And I've seen people in the comments on TikTok being like, oh my God, like, what clip is this like from? Like, oh my God, like I wanna watch this show. And then, people get met with disappointment when they realize that this edit is from a very tiny, like, mystery of the week part of the Apothecary Diaries. But I don't blame them for being incentivized to watch the show, because they saw an edit with this scene, because it's just done so well. The music playing in the background is just so lovely. There is this like anticipatory tension as he bows to her, and they kind of make their way over to the carriage. And then when they finally get into the carriage and Fuyo is just looking at him as he pulls her in for this very intense hug that is just full of years of yearning and pining and wanting, and that this reunion now is the product of two people who did not give up on each other and who found a way to get around the circumstances that they were in to be together, and that they played the long game to do this. Like, it took 2 years for Fuyo to do this, and just seeing her breaking down because her labor has paid off and she's free. And then we get a very powerful confession from Gyokyo, where she asks Maomao, would I be a bad person if I said that I envy concubine Fuyo? And Maomao obviously reassures Gyokyo that no, like, she would not be a bad person. But I think it is very telling of what life for a concubine in the rear palace is like, because Gyokyo is the emperor's favorite. She is his favorite. She, at the current moment in the story where we're at in this moment, has his only surviving child. She's intelligent. She has a really lovely support system around her of ladies in waiting that love her, that care about her. She has that companionship. But even then, even though Gyokyo is incredibly successful where she is, she wants more. Like, she ideally wants more. She is envious of the fact that Fuyo gets to leave this place, gets to have her freedom, and that she earned this freedom through being smart and through taking a risk. And then finally, at the end of this episode, we just have Maomao kind of looking off into the sunset, looking at her pinky with the part missing, talking about how there is this kind of idea that love makes a woman more beautiful. And then finally, the episode ends with the emperor visiting Gyokyo and asking her about Maomao the apothecary and how he has a special request for her. Upon rewatching these 3 episodes, my initial thought was just, wow, like, this is such a solid start to a series. I feel like a lot of people I know and myself also abide by this kind of 3-episode rule with anime, where it's like if you're not engaged by 3 episodes, it's time to move on to something else. And these 3 episodes are just they capture you. They really get you. And they leave you with all these questions like, what is this request going to be? What is the rest of this situation going to look like? What mysteries is Maomao going to solve next? Like it's done so well. It's just so special. And I am so excited to go on this ride with all of you. So thank you so much for watching. Please feel free to leave any feedback in the comments below, because again, this is the first one. We're probably going to, modify this as this series goes on. But for now, that's it. And I will see you in my next video where we go through episodes 4 to 6. Can we talk about that?